Thank you for having me here tonight and for all of you taking your precious Wednesday evening to come hear me present this. One of the contentions that I'm making in this presentation is that what we're proposing is really not one of many options. It's the logical culmination of the balancing of all of the input that we've heard, both in the historical record and in our time ourselves working with the city of Newburyport. So my firm, just by way of introduction, is we're a Providence-based firm. We're currently up to 16 folks, and we were founded in 2001 specifically for this kind of project. What we were frustrated by was the idea that planners were called in to plan, and then when they were done looking at it in 2 dimensions from 1,000 feet of altitude, then the architects came in, and the two things never came together. And there's a real disconnect in that. Architecture really has to come out of a culmination of understanding the planning involved, and that's why we came together. And specifically, we came together to help communities, because we felt that as lucrative as private commissions could be for a corporate headquarters, it was really the place where, to use an old metaphor, Rome was burning in our communities, not in the private sector, and we needed to come help communities better understand their future and their built environment. So why specifically was Union Studio asked to be here? We were asked and charged by the city and by the NRA to explore the possibilities of enhancing the city's waterfront through the disposition of the NRA lands. But significantly, very early on, part of that charge was to explore the possibility of enhancing the city's waterfront and its connection to the city. And that's a point I'm going to make repeatedly tonight because I think it bears, people I've noticed at times in this conversation the polarizing of it's either going to be developed or it's going to be open space, as if that open space does not in some way have and demand a connection to the city. So part of our charge was to understand how can we enhance this park, even if its only use is as a park, and connect it to the town more firmly so that more people could enjoy it in a seamless way with the other parts of Newburyport that they enjoy so much. And as I said, our understanding of the goals and the issues comes from a deep review of all of the historical record, which is voluminous, of this issue, all of the previous proposals, and from our own work, notably, and I'm sure many of you were here in June when we held a public presentation and a public conversation out at the waterfront, and we understood better. I think a lot of that presentation and that workshop confirmed what we had understood from the record, but other things came out too, and I'll talk about those a little more in detail. But what we came away from that cumulative understanding was these major goals. 1, enlarge the park and civic space while preserving an appropriate amount of improved parking. And I added that word improved. It wasn't in the last presentation because I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. I'll talk about more of that in a moment. Improve and enrich the experience of the park without commercializing the waterfront. That was consistent. Everybody, even folks who are in favor of some amount of development at the waterfront, don't want it commercialized. And they use that in terms that I equate to mean turned into a Coney Island or to a Atlantic City boardwalk or any of the pejorative ways we think of commercial activity on the waterfront. We were to maintain access and views to the waterfront park for all. But I think everybody reacted strongly to the idea that it would make sense to make the park and the waterfront more inviting all year round. And finally, all of this had to be done in a way that was self-funding and sustainable. And I use the word self-funding specifically relative to finances, but sustainable in its broadest possible terms. So when we talked last time about Union Studio's understanding of the built environment, and I made the caveat that, why would you care what my understanding of the built environment is? But I think you should. You should understand how we're looking at it, and I think it might be illuminating for you. We view the world through this diagram or a concept called the transect. And the transect really is this idea that there's a whole spectrum of place types that go through from the most natural and the untouched to the most urban, if you can call it, or another way to think of it is the place that's only for wildlife and the place that's only for humans, and everything in between. There are different kinds of places, and we intuitively know that. If you look at the images that I'm showing, you've got kind of a national park, and then you've got farmland, and then you've got suburbia, and then you've got what I would call the town center, which is, and then you've got something that is urban but not downtown, and then finally you've got the urban core, which is downtown Boston. Now, I would claim that Newburyport really exists right in the sweet spot of that, which is called the town center, or what we're calling the town center. And really that's in the American sense of urbanism, that's the place we've always gravitated to. Whenever you see books written about, nostalgic books written about America, they always include the idea of Main Street and the small town. You know, the images of what we are as America tend not to be the places with the high rises, and they tend to be that place where there's just enough architecture and just enough public space and just enough landscape for everything to balance in place. And I would say that's right where Newburyport is, and that's one of the reasons why it's so beloved and so protected by so many of you. But you can also think of it in the inverse, in terms of that transect and the idea of open space itself having different kinds of characters. And again, this series of diagrams using the same spectrum, you have something like the national park at the waterfront, and then something more like parkland in rural parkland, and then you come into suburbia, and then significantly you come to that place which I'm claiming Newburyport to be a part of, and that's the town center. And typically you have, if you think about New England towns all over the New England, you have this balance of architecture framing a green space, like the town green. Historically, that town green had a purpose as a common paddock for sheep, but whatever the derivation, it's become the emblem of what we think of when we think of small town America as being this balance of architecture and open space. And again, I think Newburyport displays a lot of that balance, a lot of that, and so one of the reasons I'm so attracted to it, and I think so many of you are protective of it, is you intuitively feel that too. These images of Market Landing Park, I think, talk about that balance of architecture. And so at the end of the last session, we didn't propose a design, but we offered some food for thought as the design team began. We asked the question, what's appropriate here? Obviously, it's not that image on the left. You know, everybody I'd be run out of here if we even proposed anything like that. But then again, is it like the image on the middle end of the parking lot? Is that what the waterfront should be? Should development happen on the waterfront side of Merrimac at all? If no, why not? If yes, how much and of what type? And we went through a little abbreviated history of Newburyport to understand better what the historical pattern on that waterfront has been. And that's not to say that because the historical pattern was one way that we should replicate that. It's only to suggest that there's a history there, and that history can be instructive on what we should put back. So we talked about the pattern of the waterfront and its pattern of finger piers going out into the Merrimac River, how the commercial activity was largely focused on that waterfront edge, how by the 60s that vibrant waterfront had sort of reached become sort of flea-bitten, and also it had become congested to the point where any public access at all was denied. The image on the bottom being sort of emblematic of that large warehouse building being put on the waterfront, denying the water to everybody in the community. So there was good rationale when along came urban renewal and said, listen, let's clear that out. Let's start over, let's start from a blank slate, and let's create a brave new world. But really, it's helpful to understand how successful urban renewal was, at least on the demolition side. This is what it looked like prior to urban renewal, and this is what it looked like after, with all of the space that was priorly in private hands, becoming parking, with the exception of Market Landing Park, which was very, I think, skillfully designed at that location.